Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to specifically thank Saidi and the organizing committee for inviting me to be here this afternoon. I live in Mexico, so it's been a long trip here, but it's lovely to get back to Southern Africa and be here. Time is short, so I'm going to whip through this as fast as possible and leave some time here for Pablo. Sustainability first. We're talking about sustainable intensification. We have to realize that sustainability has biophysical aspects, the ones we know about, the technological side, the environmental side, but importantly, sustainability also has economic and social aspects to it. And those we call the institutional factors. The institutional side that also has to be in place to have sustainable growth or sustainability. So CA, without markets, policy, input, supply, etc., will not lead to sustainable intensification. Just having the technology alone, without all of the other factors that have to support it, will not lead to sustainable intensification. Now, you all heard about the green revolution in South Asia. And a lot of people think that that was just varieties. Others think it was varieties and fertilizer. But it wasn't. It was the whole thing. It was the political will. It was getting the credit right. It was getting the fertilizer supply, getting the research done, getting the seed shipped from Mexico to start with, and so on. So there was all of these other aspects that had to go in to get the green revolution going. And we have to remember that it is not just technology alone. Now, recently we did an analysis of the research on CA, and this is Eastern and Southern Africa, looking at all of the research where researchers used the same fertilizer levels on all treatments. And this is a plot of that data, and we can see that the gray area across the middle that's not very clear in the slide here is plus or minus 10%, so we'll take that as the same. A lot of the results are the same, CA and conventional, and a lot more above that, so generally we're the same or better under CA than under conventional, and a few are down below where, in fact, CA was not as good as conventional agriculture, and those were the low fertility points. They were the ones where researchers didn't apply any fertilizer or just a little bit of nitrogen. And it's very important to realize that when you, under low fertility conditions, CA didn't do very well. Now, I'd like to come back to those institutional factors, the markets, the policies, and the credit, and just stress that I think we've spent a lot of time on that research to show that CA does just as well or better than conventional agriculture in the field, but we need to dedicate a lot more effort to these other factors, to these institutional factors. We've now got a method of producing sustainably and allowing sustainable intensification of agriculture in Africa. Now we need to involve all the players and move these institutional factors to achieve sustainable intensification. Now, growing more for less, it really depends from where you're starting from. It's a bit like the tourist in Ireland asking a farmer down in Kerry somewhere, can I get to Dublin from here? And the farmer says, yeah, you can get to Dublin from here, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here, right? So if you're looking for sustainable, moving into conservation agriculture, and you start from a situation like this, a low fertility place, a low fertility situation, you are not going to be able to produce more with less. You've got to invest in the system to be able to really get the potential out of it and get into sustainable intensification. Sorry. Now, This is another example. This is from Brazil. And this is the farm of one of the pioneers of CA in Brazil, Frankie Dijkstra. And you see he started off with maize yields of about 4 tons per hectare in the 1970s. And since then he's got up to about 8 tons per hectare, about double. And that's CA. In his soybeans he's gone from 2.2 to 3.6 tons. Now on his maize he now uses 30% less fertilizer than he did in 1977. And he's getting double the yield. And his soybeans he's using half of the fertilizer that he used. So starting from a high level of productivity and getting into a system, he's regenerated his soil. He's got more available nutrients. He's probably not got any more nutrients, but he's got more available nutrients today because he's beefed up the soil organic matter. And so in this case, where you're starting from a good productivity level, you can indeed produce more for less. Now, growing more for less obviously implies increased efficiency. But how do we measure this efficiency? First of all, we have to have efficient comparisons. You see a lot of research where researchers take a CA package that somebody's used over there, they just put it here, and the first year they test it and they use the same package because they don't want to change from one year to the other. They do it for 3 years and publish the results, but it's not a real comparison. They're testing a CA package that they've brought in from elsewhere. They're testing it against a practice, a conventional practice that has been adapted over decades, and obviously it's not a fair comparison. First of all, to be able to make that comparison, you've got to work on the CA package. You've got to develop it locally. You've got to get it right, and then you can compare it. Now, looking at how efficient is the CA system, I think it's worth looking at some of these different definitions and yield gaps. And this is Tony Fisher and Greg Edmeades published this a few years ago. If we look at the farmer's yield, we know this is the common farmer's yield. Some farmers do better, others less. And on the left-hand side, the potential yield. This is the biologically potential yield. It's limited by the environment, not by economics. Between that, going up from the farmer yield, we've got an attainable yield under today's economic conditions, under today's markets. And then you've got another column, which is attainable yield under improved markets. If the markets were right, if the credit was there, if the institutional factors were right, then farmers would be able to achieve more. And it's important to realize that the attainable yield depends on the economic conditions. And so we can close the yield gap between what the farmers are getting now today and the economically attainable yield. But if we improve the institutional factors, we can push up that economically attainable yield and get further up. And obviously, as we go up that progression, that is the sustainable intensification that we want to get from agriculture. Now, the attainable potential yield changes from season to season, especially under rain-fed agriculture. And how can the farmer or the researcher know how they're doing? What's the measure? How can they know whether they're producing 60%, 80%, 100% of the attainable yield? And there's a good example to me from some researchers in South Australia. Now, this is obviously not very relevant to most of us, but to those of us from North Africa, it's very relevant to that Mediterranean climate. And this was the French Schultz model. And what they did was they plotted all of the yields farm yields in South Australia against water use during the season. It's a system that has rainfall during the winter, very little storage of the moisture or moisture in the soil, and so there's a very good relationship with moisture. Instead of drawing a line through the middle, they drew a line on the upper side and said, okay, that's the potential. And farmers still use that today. 20 kilograms per millimeter of rainfall. Take away 110 millimeters for the evaporation and just the vegetative growth, and after that, 20 kilograms per millimeter of water. Under that environment, it works. I'm not suggesting that it would work here, but we need to be thinking about developing something like that that we can use here so that farmers and researchers have a measure of what they should be able to achieve. Now, the interesting thing with French and Schultz's work was then they looked at a lot of research that had been done and published, and you could see some where the researchers with their top treatment had got up to the potential yield. But there's some over on the right-hand side there where they'd applied some treatments and they're still way below the potential. So what did their research really show? There was some other limiting factor. And so what they were attributing to responses in their research was in fact way off because they were way below the potential. There was some other limiting factor. I think this would improve our research no end if we did have a measure, if we could get to a measure of what we should be achieving in a particular season. Now, achieving sustainable intensification will often require a lot more inputs than many farmers are applying today. That situation that I showed earlier, where basically no growth, we're not going to get sustainable intensification under that sort of system. And the key is to use the applied inputs efficiently. Less wastage. We can't waste inputs. We need to use them efficiently. We need to cut down on the erosion that takes away nutrients, soil organic matter, seed, and just basically make sure that we're using seed, fertilizer, soil, time, and fuel efficiently. And efficiency obviously is best measured in terms of the most limiting factor. Now, nutrients are often cited as the most limiting factor in African agriculture. And I'm sure most of us can relate to that, and I'm sure we agree with it. But at the same time, fertilizer use in Africa is very low, especially to the staple crops. Depending on how you calculate it and exactly the area, but around 10 kilos of nutrients per hectare across sub-Saharan Africa, and most of that going on to cash crops and relatively little onto the staple crops. Now, CA cannot produce more for less under those sorts of situations. It is not, to me, CA is not a low input sustainable agriculture option. It's one can say a low external input sustainable agriculture option. If one grows legumes, one can control weeds with cover crops and so on. Those are inputs, but they're not external inputs. But you've got to provide the nutrition. The crop has to have the nutrition. It has to have the weed control to get the system to go. But present systems aren't with 4 kilos, 8 kilos, 10 kilos of nutrients per year. Those aren't sustainable either. So we're talking about turning agriculture around and getting sustainable intensification by really notching up agriculture several notches. Farmers know that there's something wrong, that something's happening. They see their yields going down. They have to use more inputs to get to where they were getting some years ago. Up on the, not very clear probably, this is a blackboard from a farmers meeting where farmers talk about crops drying off. The soil is sick. They have to apply more fertilizer today than they applied before. So they know something is happening. They're obviously not into very much what soil degradation is and so on, but they're very aware of the problem. Now, they also know about fertilizer use. It's not that farmers don't know about fertilizers, but why don't they apply more? Why don't farmers apply more? And I think one of the major reasons is risk, both production risk and market risk. And if we can reduce that risk, then we can start to get more nutrients into the crop and improve productivity. And risk, remember, is like, we saw a slide today from the COMESA presentation on the likelihood of the effects of climate change in Africa. And that's going to increase the risk. We're going to see higher temperatures in a lot of the continent, more extreme weather events, heavier rainfall, more runoff, more erosion, and so that's going to increase the risk. And nutrients, moisture, and risk are all very much linked. Now, moisture stress represents probably the most common biophysical risk to African dryland crop production, at least, which is most of the crop production. But we still lose a lot of water. This work of Rockstrom's 75 to 85% of rainfall is unproductive in sub-Saharan Africa. One can expect about 50% to be unproductive. That's basically, it's going into erosion and just the vegetative growth of the crop. But any more than 50%, we know where we've got space to improve. In Zimbabwe, 30% of rainfall lost just to runoff. We can't afford to have that. We need to get to where every raindrop goes into the soil where it falls. That is, to me, the water harvesting that we want. It's not collecting runoff. We need each drop to go into the soil where it falls. Now, one of the major benefits, of course, of CA is the improved crop water balance. The improved infiltration, the reduced runoff as part of that, and the reduced evaporation. As we have with the ground cover, we reduce evaporation. Now, over on the right-hand side of this, not from here, it's in fact from Mexico, but those crops, same variety, same fertilizer. The only difference, they're both with zero tillage. One has residues at the top, one doesn't have residues. And the effect on the surface soil and the infiltration gives those sorts of differences in crop growth. Moving on a bit now with looking at this growing more for less, labor and machinery use are obviously two of the things that CA can help grow more for less of. I couldn't find much in the way of data on machinery use in Africa, but just to give you an idea of this one from John McRobert. Somebody mentioned Art Farm today. This was data from Art Farm. About a 66% reduction in machinery use with CA. And that ties in with figures that one hears from other parts and from Latin America, about 2/3 reduction. And in most surveys of smallholder farmers, they cite that one of the big benefits of CA is the reduction in labor and the reduction in drudgery. If you look at this farmer down here plowing in Ethiopia for a wheat crop, he normally plows once with his odd plow, plows again crossing it, then he broadcasts his seed and plows again. And to do that, he plows again to incorporate the seed. To do that, for each hectare he seeds, he's walking behind his oxen for 100 kilometers. 100 kilometers for each hectare sown. This lady in Malawi, Peter was talking about the ridges today. 140,000 hoe strokes per hectare to get that land prepared. 140,000 hoe strokes per hectare. That is drudgery. And if we can reduce that, I'm sure a lot of people would be happy. But of course, the reduction in labor requirements depends how you're going to do your CA. If you don't use herbicides, and if you're in a very weedy situation, as you see this situation here that we had in Zimbabwe on a land that had been abandoned to agriculture for 10 years before we got there, and that's what the farmers obviously gave us to use for the plots, then you have a huge problem. And if you can't use herbicides in that sort of situation, the amount of labor obviously is going to be very high. Also in the common system here in Zambia, also in Zimbabwe with the basins, there is more labor required than the CA system, in the CA system than in conventional agriculture, but there's more production for that greater amount of work, and there's more production per day worked, and that's an important factor for farmers. And of course, the labor is not all concentrated at the time when the rains come. It's spread out over the year, and a lot of it can be done in the dry periods. Now, CA and knowledge. Several of the farmers and the young lady from Lesotho talked about knowledge and information and finding out more about CA. And this is one aspect of CA where you definitely do not get more for less. There is no way that you can really get into conservation agriculture without more knowledge. Farmers have to know better how to manage the system. CA is knowledge intensive. There's a lot of problems that you can get over with another pass of the plow. But when you're not going to use the plow, you've got to get your management right, and you've got to know what you're doing and know how to manage the system. And I think getting this knowledge generalized, democratized, is probably one of the biggest challenges to the spread of CA. We need to enhance knowledge not just amongst farmers, but amongst researchers, extension agents, policymakers, input suppliers who are going to be giving advice to farmers on herbicides. Somebody mentioned today herbicide problems. I've seen it as well. We saw it in Zimbabwe. Farmer goes to an input supplier and gets the wrong herbicide, and then you have a disaster. So everybody has to have better information and better knowledge. And we need to facilitate farmer-to-farmer exchange. You know that farmers talk to farmers. Farmers don't believe us researchers, and I don't blame them. We're not putting our money on the line. 5? Yeah. So we really need to rethink the way we look at extension. And the extension provider or extension service agent the job changes largely from a provider of information to a facilitator of farmer exchange. And I think that is going to be very important for us. So in summary, CA is not a low input system. We have to have the inputs. The benefits of CA lie in using applied inputs more efficiently. We can get short-term gains from erosion control and improved water balance, and the economics and labor saving depend on the conformation of the CA system, especially the weed control option that we use. Institutional factors will be just as or probably more important than technological change in achieving sustainable intensification. We have to do more on those aspects. And increasing the economically attainable yield, remember changing those institutional aspects so we can get that higher economically attainable yield, and by reducing risk will be major factors in achieving sustainable intensification. More for less? Well, I think we can get more production per day worked. All of the data seems to suggest that. We can certainly get more production per liter of fuel used. We can get more efficient use of inputs, more production with the same or maybe lower investment. But if we start off from a very low base, then we're going to need investment. We're going to have more investment. We can do more production with less risk. But knowledge development is a necessity. Here we have to look at growing more with more. So thank you very much.